Welcome to the Divorce Podcast, where we explore all aspects of ending relationships, separation, and parenting apart. If your marriage or partnership has ended, or you have friends and family who are separating, this podcast is for you. I'm Kate Daly, a relationship counsellor, divorce specialist, and co-founder of Amicable, the online legal service for separating couples. In each episode, we look at relationships and separation from different angles, including the emotional, legal, and social. I'm joined by experts and special guests who share their own unique stories, experience, and tips, with the goal of helping people end relationships in a kinder and better way. In this episode, I'm joined by an award-winning author, Laura Pritchett, to discuss all the nuances of communicating during and after the end of a relationship. We begin by discussing Laura's essay, No Sound, No Fury, No Marriage, and her own experience of divorce that inspired her to write this piece. Laura shares how communication evolved throughout her relationship and post-divorce. We move on to talk about Laura's latest novel, 3 Keys, and how the experience of writing it helped her process her feelings about the separation. We end with Laura sharing how she communicated with her kids about her divorce, and she gives some advice on what to do if you're in the process of ending your marriage or relationship. If you loved this episode, then please subscribe and rate us on your preferred listening platform. Welcome, Laura.
Thanks so much for having me. What a delight.
It's really lovely to meet you, and thank you so much for joining us. This podcast episode is going to be all about nuance, and I guess to summarize for anyone who hasn't read your essay, the No Sound, No Fury, No Marriage essay, really in a nutshell is all about leaving a marriage when there's no big catastrophe, there's no big drama or something that's gone horribly wrong and that is obvious to the sort of outside onlooker. And it's a story that's probably familiar to maybe lots of people listening. And I think a lot of people struggle with some of the feelings associated with leaving what looks to be a perfectly functioning marriage from the outside, at least. So I'm really interested to get your sort of take and your thoughts on how you navigated that and some of the emotions that came up as a consequence of leaving that marriage. So if you don't mind, Laura, can we start by just you giving us a bit of an outline about, how you met your partner, your marriage, and how it sort of came to its end?
Absolutely. We met in our early 20s. We were both young and we both came from households that were very violent and loud. And so I think we came together and our primary focus was being calm and thoughtful, in reaction to the childhood we had had. And we both grew up together in a certain way and went on to earn our PhDs and both entered academia, both became professors and then administrators. So we were, and are calm, thoughtful people who know how to communicate. I would say, we certainly run meetings and can be thoughtful in our approach to those. But even with that awareness or, education or something, we certainly failed in being able to communicate as a loving couple. And by that, I mean, that friendly banter, sitting on the couch, chuckling, sharing a movie, talking about favorite moments of the day. And from the outside, it looked like we were this successful, couple who had 2 beautiful kids, and they are beautiful, and that everything was well. But underneath, I think, well, I can only speak for myself, but I feel like I was dying of loneliness. Like it was really getting quite serious. It felt like I just was alone in the world and didn't have a place to share my fears, or I felt like I couldn't enter into any real kind of communication. Certainly we could talk about our day. We could have meeting type communications, who's taking the kids to soccer practice and that sort of thing. But I did not feel like I could express who I was. And if I was too emotive, I think he felt pestered by that, or I felt like he was judging me for that. So
Do you think that was something you lost, or do you think it was never quite there?
I think it was never quite there. And we've been divorced for 10 years. So I've had time to reflect and really contemplate, what role did I have? What role did he have? And try to enter into it with a real openness of heart and grace. And I just think, wow, even from the beginning, we had trouble connecting on that deep emotive level. And of course, from my perspective, which is biased and subjective, I feel like he probably had trouble accessing his emotions and therefore wasn't really open to hearing mine. But of course, that's my perspective.
So it felt like almost there would be a bit of a danger in going to that emotional space, maybe because of the background and in case the emotions became somehow uncontrolled and loud or violent in some kind of way. Is that it? Or is it something slightly different?
Oh, I think that's a part of it. That's a good way of summarizing it. I just think it wasn't allowed. There was no space for any kind of conflict. And that's what the piece is about in the New York Times, No Sound, No Fury, No Marriage, which I have to say, I love the woman who read it in the recent podcast. Her voice is just fabulous. But we just didn't know how to have conflict well. And our attempts through therapy and reflection on it just didn't get us there.
Do you think that's a viable concept though because we talk about this a lot in the therapeutic world, don't we? The rules of a row, but do you think that that's possible then? Or do you think that's beyond most of us?
I do think it's possible. And I myself have learned so much in the last 10 years, but also I've come to realize it really depends on who you're with, because the relationships I've had since and the one I have now is full of very healthy, serious discussions. You could call them rows, but they're kind and they're towards a mutual goal of understanding each other, and they're held in a safe space. So I know that I can do it. And I've certainly gotten better at it. I just feel like my ex-husband and I couldn't find that space no matter how hard we tried.
Mm. What do you think then it takes to be able to navigate that conflict well? That's a big question, sorry.
Well, primarily it needs two willing partners, right? Both people have to be willing to create the space for it, have the patience for it, set aside time for it. And if that is not happening, one person is going to feel like they're just hitting a brick wall again and again, I think.
So it sounds like then when your marriage was kind of breaking down, it was a very slow kind of ripping that plaster off very slowly. What did you experience during that time that led you to a point of thinking, this is done for me?
Well, I drove to a writing residency. I was working on a novel, and in the back of my car, I had all of my diaries and journals. And my goal was to sit crisscross applesauce on the floor and surround myself with all of my journals and take a look at my process and evolution and what I had been writing about and sometimes complaining about, for decades, and just try to get a handle on, like, was it me? Was it him? Because it was so vague. And on the way, I was listening to Eckhart Tolle, and he had this great part in one of his books. I can't remember which one, but basically he said, look, in a situation, you have three options. You can accept it, you can leave it, or you can work to change it. And I thought, I've worked to change it. I've really tried. I've tried therapy and I've suggested things, and I really feel like I've invested. I can't change it, or I can't accept it. I can't live this way. I just had this fear that I would become, really, to be honest, like an alcoholic who watched TV all day. I just couldn't be that lonely. I didn't know how to exist in the world and be that lonely, because I wanted to be in a partnership. I have lots of girlfriends and lots of friends, and I have a busy social life and students and faculty members and all that, but I wanted a real partnership. And so then the third choice was to leave it. And when I got to the writing residency, I read all of those diaries and I saw how hard I had worked and how much I feared divorce for the kids. It would have been fine if it were just me, but I was really staying in the marriage for the kids. And so I just had to really surround myself with my own words, my own reflections that went on for 22 years. We were married 22 years, and I could see how unhappy I was. And I worried for the future me that there would be 20 more years of these journals and they would be saying the same thing. And I just broke down crying and I thought, I can't do it. This can't be my life.
Such an interesting paradox, isn't it? One of the things that often people talk to us about, and particularly in the therapeutic space when they're contemplating leaving a relationship, is their fear of loneliness and being alone. And yet I can remember going through my own divorce that in the run up to the divorce, I have never felt loneliness like that. It is the most lonely place in the world to be, I think, lying in a bed next to somebody where there is no emotional, spiritual, let alone physical connection there at all. It is just the darkest place I can ever really remember. And I can tell you, I've been on my own for a long time. There is no loneliness that you have as an individual when you're sort of out of that kind of context that ever compares to that sort of loneliness when you're in a relationship. It's really palpable, isn't it?
Oh, exactly. You put it so well. There was never a more lonely time than when I was married. I was so much less lonely when I was single. Exactly. And it's heartbreaking. It's a heartbreaking place to be.
When you got to the point of realizing for you this was over, how did you bring about the end of the relationship? It must have been quite a tough conversation. And I don't want to put words in your mouth. I imagine if there's no outward sign, you're not arguing or shouting, no one's having an affair, it must be quite a challenging conversation to have with your partner at that point. How did you put into words what you had concluded?
That's what the New York Times piece tries to capture, is that very moment of me sitting on a couch. And I'll never forget, it's a blue couch and there were all these dust motes coming through the window, lit up by the sun. And I just said, we need to end. This relationship is over. And I expected maybe some kind of answer like, no, let's work together, or let's not. But what there was silence. And that was heartbreaking. And that was quite indicative of our whole relationship. He did not want the divorce, but he also didn't respond. And it was just so quiet. And I thought, this is why, And later we had other discussions, many of which circled around how to tell the children and how to do it right and how to be kind and compassionate to each other. But it was just so quiet. It was the kind of quiet that I feel like just breaks your eardrums. It's like a buzzing, loud quiet.
It must have been incredibly well, I suppose on one hand, it totally, as you just said, it reflects totally what was wrong in the relationship for you. But on the other hand, it's just incredibly sad.
It is, because I think generally speaking, we are two good people. We just weren't the right people to be in relationship with. And it took us a long time to figure that out.
Did that not make you feel angry on some level?
I think I had been angry, simmering angry for years. And at that point, I was just sad. Like at some point, the anger dissipates and you're just left with heartache.
I mean, you talk about silence quite a lot in that article. It sort of symbolizes that lack of communication, doesn't it, throughout maybe the relationship. I wonder to what extent that those silences continued through the divorce, or whether the divorce then had a life of its own and became a different way of being and relating to each other, and maybe in some weird way and almost more successful, because the relationship you describe sounds like the relationship we try and coach co-parents into, this less intense, this kind of more business-like relationship that in theory allows you to be less emotional about co-parenting your kids. So I wonder how the relationship changed during the separation.
Well, that we excelled at, and I'm really happy. We did have a nice business type relationship of sharing responsibilities with the kids and respecting each other's needs and time off. And that was pretty ideal, I think, because we did have that kind of relationship. As the kids got older, we needed to communicate less, of course. And so sadly, there's not much communication at all anymore. And that's not what I wanted. I wanted a relationship that would continue in that kind of capacity where at least we could see each other at holidays or have some banter back and forth just about the kids. But it's not what he wanted, and he's remarried with new kids. And so we don't communicate much anymore. But during those years of co-parenting, I think we did a really nice job of that.
Well, it's good to hear, isn't it? And it sounds like your relationship lent itself to being able to do that for your children. So it's never as black and white, is it? Relationship breaks down equals failure equals bad. There are always lots of positive things to take out. And I like the thought that you were able to use the strengths ultimately within that relationship to build something for your children as well. I think that's quite a hopeful message. I was just thinking about, where were you in the work cycle at this point? So your marriage is breaking down. You're talking to your kids about it. Was your work helping or hindering you process what was happening at that stage?
Well, besides being in academia, I'm a novelist, and the novels really helped me process. They always have different things, but one thing that all 7 novels have in common is that they are about communication. I think that is one of my core themes. And I'm fascinated by the way that 2 well-intentioned, thoughtful people still can fail at communication. Language is limiting. It's what we have, and it's wonderful, but it doesn't always do the job 100%. And so in all of my novels, communication is a theme. But in the ones I was writing post-divorce, it was never about my life specifically, but you can see those themes rear up, especially in my most recent novel, The 3 Keys, in which the main character is thinking about leaving her husband, and then he dies of a stroke. And so she's driving across the American West, breaking into people's homes with these 3 keys she has. And that part's fiction. I did not break into people's homes. But what she's dealing with was guilt and sadness because she was about to leave her husband. And the reason she was about to leave her husband was that he was just so distant. He was always in the basement doing other projects that did not involve her. And he had really removed himself from her life. And so you can see that part of the story is close to home.
It's fascinating, isn't it? And I guess in that sense, you must have a complete mix of emotions, because I wonder whether there's some annoyance at death having got there first in a way as well. If I had decided I was going to leave somebody and then something happened, a little bit of me somewhere would still feel that I hadn't had the opportunity to do what I feel I needed to do or say. I guess when you've got that taken away, you don't have the opportunity to resolve whatever has led you to that point. And I guess for a lot of people, if one person refuses to communicate with you and just says for them it's over and there's nothing more, I suppose they must be left with very similar feelings, that frustration of not really having the opportunity to process and talk things out and to understand what's gone wrong for the other person and for themselves.
Exactly. I do think that the main thing she learns, my main character, Amelie, on this middle-aged journey across the American West, is that she has to hold conflicting and complicated and nuanced emotions in her heart at the same time and just be with them. And there is no one or the other or black and white or right or wrong. They're just all there. And I think any of us who have been on the planet for long recognize that we can both be heartbroken and delighted by the sunrise or something at the exact same moment.
Yeah. But I think that's it. And I think a lot of the conversation around divorce is polarized. And I sometimes think it's because we're so used to looking at divorce or separation through a legal lens. And our legal systems are adversarial legal systems that automatically try and polarize. And in lots of cases, the family systems mirror the criminal justice system. So there's a right and there's a wrong. There's a plaintiff, there's a defendant. Do you know what I mean? And I think because of that language and because of that lens, we sometimes get to a situation where we're trying to look for the good guy and the bad guy. And we can't hold in our minds that relationships can come to an end and there doesn't have to be a good guy and a bad guy. And there can be a whole complex web of emotions that as outsiders, we don't have the right or the privilege of understanding. But yet we always seek to try and make a narrative because our brains go to needing a story, don't they, all of the time? I'm wondering, in a world where there isn't an obvious, easy sentence, he had an affair, I had an affair, there isn't a he did this or she did that kind of reason to the breakdown of a marriage. How did you deal with telling other people that you were ending the marriage and that the marriage was over?
That was really difficult because people were truly confused, and I don't blame them for being confused. The neighbors, our friends, my parents, my siblings. And I wanted to be respectful of him and the children and kind of leave everyone their privacy to the extent I could. But just to say, my truth is that I cannot remain in this marriage. I'm too lonely and there's some really big gaps. But I wish him well and I wish me well. I just really tried to stay away from that blame or there's a bad guy. I don't think I ever described him as being the bad guy. I did say we seem to be incompatible in some really fundamental ways.
And so, would you think people accepted that and would leave it at that with you, or did people press you?
They did press me, and that was awkward. And it made me just want to withdraw for a while and avoid all those conversations. That's part of my personality too, of like, I get silent and introverted when stressed. But I think eventually people came to see that I was happier on my own. And many neighbors and siblings said, "Oh, you are so much happier now." And maybe that was the evidence they needed.
Yeah. Do you think they doubted you then? Did you get anyone criticize you for giving up too early? Because we live in this world, don't we, where marriage is revered and we're expected to, like make a go of it and keep trying. And, it's this sort of end state of one's adult life, isn't it? To get married and to be happily ever after. So do you think you got pushback on wanting to leave?
Probably. But I had gone through so much self-reflection and therapy myself that by the time I made the decision, I thought to myself, I don't care too much what people think. I know this is right for me. I will keep living a good and kind life, and they will either accept me as I am or they won't. And that's just going to have to be the way it is. So by the time I called it, I was in a place of sturdiness, I would say, and that really helped.
It sounds like having that therapy, that private space was really key to being able to navigate the sort of in being in the middle of the divorce and then the post-divorce kind of landscape, if you like.
Absolutely. And I'm so glad I kept journals. I advocate that. I'm a writer, so of course I'm biased, but I think having documentation of how you felt in year 1 of a marriage or year 10 or year 8, it's helpful to be able to reflect.
And I guess look back and spot patterns maybe as well, and to see the evolution of the relationship and to see whether it's going in the right direction from your perspective. So I think that's one of the things people find very difficult when they're at the point of ending a relationship. I know I did. You like one day you think, no, it's fine. It's all fine. It's going to be fine. And then the next day you're just thinking, oh my God, it's not fine. It's not fine. And you sort of flip flop between it's fine. Everyone has bad patches and to like thinking, no, this is definitely not right. And I feel it in my gut that it's not right. And I think unless, as you say, you can write that down and you can look back at that, it's very hard to know which one of those feelings is the truth. And then, as you say, to actually get to a point where you can hold both in your mind at the same time and know that they're both truthful, but still have an overarching strategy. I think it's really complicated, isn't it, when you're deciding to leave and communicating leaving. And it's tricky. It's really tricky.
It's tricky, but I love what you said. That was perfect. We do flip-flop, and that's why, for me, having a whole, bunch of journals, they were just spread out all around me, and being able to look at them and really see the arc of my life was so helpful.
And I guess the other thing that I was wondering when you were just talking before about, you were focused very much on the communication and getting it right for your children. Tell us a little bit more about that. How did you navigate? Did you do a sit down with the children? How did you actually do the nitty gritty of talking to your kids about it? Because I guess as parents, if you're in a relationship and you're unhappy, it's the biggest fear, isn't it? That somehow you'll damage your kids or you won't get that bit right. Or, that's the worst part of it is learning to not necessarily see your kids every day and all of that part of it. So how did you embark on that part of it? Because it sounds like you were quite together and calm about that bit. I might be wrong there, but from what you were saying, it sounds like that bit went quite well from your perspective.
Well, it did go well, but also that was by far the most difficult thing about divorce. I think divorce with children, there will almost always be a sense of unease about it because you know that their lives are forever changed and holidays will be complicated. And plus they've got to start seeing you as individuals instead of the unit of my parents, that no, they have to see you as two very individual people. And it's hard for them. And we got them in therapy right away. And we absolutely did everything we could. But I'm in love with them. They're the great loves of my life. And to see them suffer hurt me. It hurt. They're in their early 20s now. And I think now it's much easier because they can laugh about it. They can look at their dad and they can look at me and they can say, yeah, you two are very different people. You go through the world in different ways. And we have a sense of understanding now why this didn't work out. And they chuckle about it, and there's open communication, and I love that. So now it's at a better place. But when they were in their early teens, they were very confused and just didn't understand. And I don't blame them. And just trying to answer any questions and keep that communication going, while at the same time being quite sad myself, so it was a tough time. I don't want to repeat that time of my life.
No, I can totally appreciate that. It's very difficult, isn't it? Especially when you're dealing with some of, as you say, the most tricky conversations at possibly the worst time of your life, where you have the least capacity sometimes to be the bigger person and your best self. So, yeah, I think anybody that's going through that will probably be able to share that sentiment. And I wonder to what extent you think their view of marriage has been changed by, what they've seen you do. Because to me, you've had a completely authentic experience. You've looked at something and said, well, there might not be any of the sort of normal trappings of this not working, but this is not an authentic place or space for me. I think that comes across loud and clear in that article. And I admire the courage to be your authentic self. It's something, you strive for when you're leading or trying to lead, a thoughtful life. So I totally admire that. How do you think your desire, your courage to do that has impacted their understanding of what it means to be married?
Well, I will say I think both of them are much smarter and emotionally wise than I ever was. And some of it surely came out of this, but they ended up being very interested in psychology and know quite a lot about relationship and maneuvering in relationship and being honest and being their authentic selves. My son's been in a relationship for 5 years, and they have no plans to get married. I think the whole cultural notion of getting married and the ideas around that have really changed. So it's not just their personal experience, but a cultural experience. And I think they would both not get married for the reasons I did. And I think they would be much more thoughtful about the reasons they were getting married. And I don't think either want to start a family. And that has more to do with political and environmental justice issues. But that really changes the conversation about marriage too. So they seem smarter, and that makes me so happy.
Yes. Well, you hope some of the genetic stuff's rubbed off on them, don't you? And then the situational lived experience part as well. It's very interesting to be able to talk to you about the sort of, not the advantages, but some of the positives of, raising resilient children ultimately. And the podcast is all about trying to look on, the brighter side of what is always a difficult situation. So I thank you for that. Genuinely, it's nice to hear that reflection. I guess there might be people listening, Laura, who are in the midst of, thinking about what their relationship is about and whether or not it's a keeper. What would you say to those people listening now if they're embarking on this kind of journey of self-discovery and considering whether or not their marriage is a success?
I think the first thing I would say is hard conversations, tender, vulnerable conversations, they simply must be had. No one wakes up and thinks, oh, good, I get to have a hard conversation today. Like, no one looks forward to it. But there are people who will do it and people who won't do it. And that we have to strive to be the people who will do it, that will have the hard conversations. And so I think that's the main thing I would say is have those conversations. And I have to say that after the New York Times piece came out, I got so many emails from people, strangers, way more emails than I've ever gotten for any of my novels or other nonfiction, saying that I had really helped their marriage, that they were now going to sit down on the couch with their partner and have the conversation that had been brewing inside them for years or decades or months. And that made me happy. That's the whole reason I think writers write, is to get beyond the self and communicate and to show people that we're not so alone on this planet, that we're all grappling with this. That pleased me. And I think this podcast does the same, right? It encourages people to push themselves and hopefully they will have those conversations. And then that will help determine whether or not to stay or to go and how to proceed with kindness and grace either way.
I love that. I can't think of a better place to end. Laura, it's been amazing talking to you. Thank you very much indeed for joining me on the Divorce Podcast today. Where can people find out more about you?
My book, 3 Keys, is on the Penguin Random House website, and it's also on my website, which is laurapritchett.com. And that last name is Pritchett. And that website contains all my books, and my email address is there as well.
Fantastic. And are you working on another novel at the moment?
Well, I just had this one come out, so I'm going to rest for a little bit, but then...
You sound like you deserve a rest. Rest and reflect.
Yes.
That's wonderful. We'll put all the details of where to find your books in the show notes as well. So if you didn't catch that, people, that is definitely going to be on the sidebar of the podcast. Thank you, Laura, for joining me. Remember, folks, if you like the episode, please subscribe and listen to more episodes of the Divorce Podcast. You can find us on thedivorcepodcast.com or on your favorite listening platform. Thanks so much indeed, Laura, for joining me. And thank you, everybody, for listening.
Thank you.